welcome to Crank It Up. I'm Jim Price, and on this episode of Teaching Power, I want to talk about deck management. Last week, I mentioned that choosing your deck was the first and most important choice you make, but your selection doesn't guarantee victory because there is still a game to play. That means managing your cards as resources, and there are a lot of concepts that go into deck management, which I will go over today. Not all, but many of these terms are terms that I invented for convenience that have been well adopted by the Smash Up community, as it helps to categorize abilities when you are looking for specific ones. But a deck consists of cards, and we need to talk about cards before we can understand what to do with them. Smash Up consists of pre-constructed decks. You choose the faction, you get its 20 cards. Maybe you get a Titan. While you technically build a deck at startup, it is not a deck building game. Conceptually, there are no bad cards or starter cards like you see in Dominion or Star Realms. You don't dilute your deck with community cards like Eminent Domain. Cards are only bad by circumstance if the game chooses to make them bad. However, this doesn't mean that all cards are equal, because they aren't, and sometimes a good card is simply not the right card right now. This basic principle will guide many of the discussions to be found within deck management, so I wanted to start there first. The first principle that I want to talk about is one that admittedly may not exist in Smash Up currently, but is a fundamental concept to Smash Up that the community often talks about, and that is deck foresight. Do you know what is coming in your deck? Done properly, this is an incredible advantage. It allows you to play proactively rather than reactively, instead of taking a chance on drawing specific cards. Sometimes, for a faction like Penguins or Grannies or Wizards, you get actual synergy boosts for knowing the order of your deck. To gain deck foresight, you need to see the cards in your deck. The problem is that almost every time deck foresight comes in the form of deck manipulation, which is the ability to alter the order of your deck. Traditionally, deck foresight is knowing, manipulation is changing, which is essentially always partnering with knowing. Smash Up admittedly doesn't simply value knowing the order of cards beyond rearranging like the players do. To illustrate this, I want to talk about another aspect of deck foresight, and that is how it matters to rival players. It's one thing if you know what's coming for you, it's another thing if your opponents do as well. When interacting with your deck, there are two main types of interactions, looks and reveals. Looking means only you can see it, whereas everyone sees a reveal. Implicitly, when you search for a card, it is a reveal, so the benefit of searching is offset by the knowledge given that you have said card. Sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad. For example, if you know I have a Seeing Stars, you won't leave an invader out for me to shuriken. This might mean that you never play an unprotected invader, which is good for the ninja player, as they are suppressing your plays. But it also means that your opponent knows exactly how to play their turns. They don't need to waste time considering a risky play, which is bad for the ninja player. More often than not, you don't want players seeing your cards, so cards that let you look for the sake of looking would be incredibly powerful in this context. This is something that could easily evolve in the future, especially if that information matters. But as I said before, it's almost always deck manipulation. Deck manipulation exists in both look and reveal forms. Consider Spy versus Halloween Townfolks, which can rearrange the top 3 cards of your deck. While Halloween Townfolks has draw potential, it does convey information, whereas Spy does not. For some players, this is really important, and it means that they have to value the deck manipulation against the control of information. Deck manipulation is important because it can do a number of things. It can position cards in your deck in a specific location so that cards can maximize their plays. One of the earliest examples of this is Portal. You will see 5 cards, and some may be actions, but you can position the right card on top so that you can play it with a neophyte. For playing a Mystic Studies type card, this is great, but there are other uses as well. Let's say you are playing Wizard Incas and you play Portal, revealing 5 cards, one of which is a base modifier, and there are some really unfortunate cards lined up for your circumstance. Portal has you put all the 5 cards back, but you can be clever. You can position the base modifier you want as the second card, then use Ink and Engineer to reveal until you hit the base modifier. Because you had an unrevealed leftover card, you trigger a shuffle, so now what you draw next changes, and maybe you don't draw those wrong for now cards right now. Alternatively, if you have great cards coming up, you can put the card you want on top to be sure that you don't re-trigger a shuffle. Because it's 5 cards, you might get cards 4 and 5 a turn faster, assuming you struck out on minions. However you play it, deck manipulation is powerful because it implicitly gives foresight, and you can use the foresight to maximize the value of your cards. Cards like Portal and Favor of Athena manipulate your deck by controlling what is coming, but there is an increasingly common archetype that defers what is coming, which I call deck sifting. Deck sifting often comes in higher quantities than draw at the expense of not actually drawing the cards. Examples of deck sifting are cards like Field Trip and Cosmic Knowledge. Deck sifting is often justified by the idea that some cards aren't the right cards for right now, and aggressively hunting for your best cards can make some sense. This played out in a March Smashes exhibition match where it was Miskatonic Wizards against Star Roaming Aliens, and Miskatonic Wizards were losing and in a tough spot, with an Invader coming next turn for the win. While Wizards can draw cards, they can't draw that many cards in an instant, and the player was ready to concede. But as a neutral arbitrator in a meaningless game, I told the player to field trip his entire hand because I bet that 10 of the 15 cards left had the card he needed, and it absolutely worked. Deck sifting has that type of power if the situation presents itself, but it does have drawbacks that are often overlooked. For starters, you are just deferring cards to the future. Maybe you won't see those cards again, maybe you will. In my experience, you often do, especially if you have shuffling, so putting them on the bottom doesn't accomplish all that much when weighed against the opportunity cost. In this regard, there are two types of sifting, active sifting and passive sifting. Is the sifting accomplished by playing a card? That is active sifting. It means that one of your two plays goes towards setting up your deck. Cards like Spy and Grammar are examples. Passive sifting means you've already paid the cost of entering play, and you can sift as you like. Most of the time, I don't like active sifting personally unless it is the right situation and a high enough quantity. Otherwise, I don't think it is worth the opportunity cost. Other players do, and that's just my playstyle. But I love passive deck sifting, with Petals of the Rose being among the best in the game. I have aggressively sifted 8 to 10 cards, even more sometimes, for the cost of playing it once. The reason for this is that it's a minor opportunity cost for the upside of a continued benefit for most, if not all, of the game. Compare this with one of the more controversial cards in the game, a card that I have debated many times with players, strategize. Strategize has you look at 4 cards, putting 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. First, I don't like how this card can make you forcefully bury 2 good cards if all 4 cards are good. But let's say that cards 3 and 4 are good cards and cards 1 and 2 are bad. Yes, you can bury cards 1 and 2, ensuring that the next cards you draw are 3 and 4. However, compare this against Mystic Studies, where you just draw 2 cards. In this scenario, wherever the 2 good cards are, you are guaranteed to see them by the end of your turn, since if you draw 2 bad cards, the 2 good cards are left, and if you draw the 2 good cards, you draw the bad ones, but you have the upside of having the good cards earlier, and you don't run the risk of inadvertently burying any good cards. The only time a card like Strategize matters is when you need a specific card to be in a specific place, which does happen, but it is rare, like Granny's wanting a minion on the bottom. It's far more often that you want a card on the top, which will help with cards like Penguins and Robots, but in the vast majority of cases, cards are played from hand, so having cards in hand matters more. And I say that knowing that I led this video with the value of deck Foresight, but this is your action play, and the Avengers have no minion plays to make use of the benefit. However, they do have shuffling, which means that the deferred cards will come back again, requiring a second sift potentially. So when I say that sifting alone doesn't solve the problem, this is precisely what I mean. However, there is a trick you can do in order to avoid this. When I play Spies, I sift aggressively because they have an internal imbalance of cards, and deck sifting is crucial in decks like that. However, that means that when you get to the bottom of your deck, you are going to draw some lackluster cards and have some very slow turns. To avoid this, you can use the rules of deck management to your advantage. Anytime you need to interact with cards while you have no deck, your discard is shuffled and becomes your deck. So as long as you have less than 5 cards, you can play your second copy of For My Eyes Only, which will reset your deck and set aside another card. Now, those cards that you deferred originally have a chance to be deferred again, and this could avoid 2 turns of pain. It's incredibly effective and keeps the spy momentum going, and I was generally surprised to learn just how much of the player base didn't know you could do this or think to do it. So sifting does have its workarounds, but it's not nearly as clean as another concept that I personally prefer, which is called overdrawing. Smash Up has a hand limit of 10 cards. You get 2 free cards per turn. You start with 5 cards. In the simplest case, you play 2 cards, then draw 2 back. Repeated indefinitely, you never hit the limit. But this is obviously not the case. You withhold plays, and you have card draw. Sometimes you even play cards faster than you draw them. But I often find myself up against the hand limit, and discarding doesn't feel fun. However, there's a simple truth that is often forgotten. While there are no bad cards unless the game makes them bad, some cards just don't have the right opportunity. And the truth is, you won't play every card in your hand. You simply won't, even if you win. It is incredibly rare to do so and requires specific factions that I win the game with 0 cards in my hand. And for most of those factions, it means dumping all your cards in one go, in which case I value aggressive drawing. Overdrawing means that you say, I don't care about hand size, draw as much as you can. When you discard, is effectively a form of sifting. While it means you don't get to use that card, it also means you don't have to see that card twice. Sometimes this means making hard calls on what to discard because the vast majority of cards are in fact good. But consider the mind game this does to your opponent. If you discard a 4, which I've done, how awesome must your hand be to facilitate such a choice? It can also be done strategically. I did this with Steampunk Tricksters to intentionally discard an Enshrouding Mist, knowing that I'd play it with Mechanic for free anyway next turn, and that it would enable me to have a burst to win the game, which it did. In this regard, Overdraw lets your discard function like a second hand. Overdrawing works because it says that instead of setting up what I will draw eventually, just draw it now and play for upside. In my experience, new players are afraid of discarding because they don't know what to discard, but in reality, deck sifting is a form of temporary discard, so they have to answer the same question. While I'm on the subject of draw, it's important to talk about the different types of draw because some players measure card draw simply as the number of cards that say, draw a card. And this is very misleading. Card draw doesn't just mean pulling cards from the top of your deck. It's anything that can expand your options. For example, pulling specific cards is a form of draw. It's still drawing a card, just a specialized form of one. Sometimes this isn't what you want, but sometimes it is. The rock stars have both direct and indirect draw. The direct draw comes from Classic Rocker, whose card could be anything, while the Monarch specifically pulls groupies. Both are incredibly valuable and powerful, and having both is honestly somewhat shocking. The best way to think about draw is from an overall deck count. How fast is that number going down? Because the faster it goes down, the more certainty you have that you will get to the cards you really need. This means that milling can apply here as well. Though it doesn't read like it, Maul Crawl is essentially the game's first draw 3 cards, because you remove 3 Tenacious Z's from your deck, eliminating your need to draw them, and effectively giving you a 37 card deck. Because the zombies treat their discard pile as an extension of their hand, they don't necessarily want to draw cards they can mill out instead, giving them better access to actions they do want to draw. It's what makes fans so powerful, and in my opinion broken. It is a free card draw that gives you a 36 card deck because there's no consequence to using its ability, and it makes drawing Will Wheaton or Felicia Day that much more likely and powerful. There are other draw concepts that are more advanced, but at its core, understanding direct and indirect draw will help you aggressively overdraw and get to your game plan cards faster. Most of this video has focused on what you get from your deck, but deck management is much more than that, and I need to spend some time on what you put back into it. Recursion is incredibly powerful and increasingly more common in modern cards, but there is an often overlooked concept that we call overshuffling. Whereas overdrawing is very good, overshuffling is very bad. It's actually a very simple concept. The more cards you put into your deck, the less likely you are to see any of them. This reduces your certainty and makes it harder to make a plan. Imagine shuffling 1 card into a deck of 3 cards compared to shuffling 3 cards into the same deck. In the first situation, you will see that cards in 2 turns, guaranteed, assuming no other changes. In the latter situation, it's 3 turns. And if your deck is that thin, the game has gone on for a while, and that third turn might not exist. But what happens more often is that overshuffling occurs in the mid-game, erasing any momentum you have. Knowing how many cards to put back and when to do so is vitally important, and could be its own video outright, but I at least want to touch on it here. Some things you need to consider are how many cards can I recur and how many cards must I recur. While it is a bad fit internally, Lend a Hand gives you the perfect granularity of cards. 1.21 gigawatts does not, and you must shuffle everything back. That should serve as a warning. For some reason, there is a growing tendency that new players assume that there is a penalty when your deck is exhausted, but this doesn't happen. The penalty, if anything, is losing the ability to shuffle into a thin deck, so don't worry about your deck running low. Quite the opposite, you want it to run low so that when you put cards back, you maximize your chance of seeing them again. Sometimes this means ensuring your deck does not reset, but that is a topic for another time. Deck management is such a crucial aspect of the game because it extends beyond your individual combo selection, even though some factions use your deck differently than others. Sometimes a combo wins the game regardless of the players, but more often, the player wins the game despite the combo, and deck management is a large part of being a skilled player. I hope you find these concepts helpful as they give you micro decisions to consider from turn to turn, which increases the depth to the complexity ratio and dispels any myth that this is a simple, casual game. What are your thoughts on deck management? Do you prefer sifting or overdrawing? Which factions have inherent deck management that you like most? Let me know these thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe. Let's shut it down.